rivers such as the Red River of the North in Dakota that seems to have a flooding problem about every other year now. And many of the rivers in the Minnesota and in the upper Mississippi River generally. To my mind, I think a lot of this flooding could have been alleviated to a degree by retaining that water in the natural wetlands rather than having drained it out. So the work in Aberdeen was fascinating. The program shifted focus over the years to the point that we were able to offer something affirmative, positive to farmers in the way of actually purchasing or providing them with easement payments if they would retain the wetlands in their present condition. So if you travel through the Dakotas nowadays, you'll see many WPA signs, wetland preservation areas, Fish and Wildlife Service signs, and these were areas that were evaluated and recommended for purchase by the federal government, and I did a great deal of that work in northeastern South Dakota. George Junkel did much of it in southeastern South Dakota, and some of the people I named did it in North Dakota and in Minnesota. So we had an incentive for the farmers to consider some other use of their wetlands than draining them for crops. And perhaps even more important than that, I think, was just raising the elevation of knowledge of the value of wetlands to the general public. At one time, back in those days, people had little appreciation of a wetland. It was a place where you had to drive your tractor around and hopefully not stick your tractor in it. And I think there's a pretty fair understanding nowadays nationwide that wetlands are indeed some of our most productive types of habitat and most threatened. So Marilyn and I spent 7 years in Aberdeen on the wetlands program and raised a family and part of the family in the process there. And the Aberdeen days were great days. We had some wonderful times there. I was very fortunate to share an office in Aberdeen with Jerry Stout, one of the old original flyway biologists, and one of the most memorable people I can ever imagine meeting. And there's only one Jerry Stout, and we visited a great deal, and I learned a great deal about wetlands in the Dakotas and also from Jerry's work in Canada. Ray Murray was also in the office for a while, and he worked out of the Northern Prairie Wildlife Research Center once it got set up. Well, enjoyed the days in Aberdeen a great deal, and the habitat work a great deal, but an opportunity came back to go back to Patuxent to work with Walt Chrissy and his brand new deputy, a fellow by the name of Dr. Al Geis. Al Geis was a statistician, and one of the most, together they were among the most remarkable people I've ever met in my life. And so Al Geis came out to visit us in Minneapolis. Let me back up, I missed a step there. But going from Aberdeen, I had an opportunity to go into Minneapolis to the regional office. Back into the outfit I left down in Texas. And they had a job there that was called Assistant Regional Supervisor Technical. And this was chiefly a biological job in a law enforcement outfit, which sounds a little strange, but the law enforcement officers, the game management agents, were still being used for banding and surveys and everything up to that time. So there was a legitimate need there. They participated in winter surveys and went to Canada and everything. So it made sense in that respect. And Art Hawkins at one time held that position. And Art Hawkins was still in the Minneapolis office as a Mississippi flyway biologist. And so I viewed that as an opportunity maybe to spend some time with Art and work with him. And so that was also an incentive. So so we moved to Minneapolis and ended up 3 years there. And it was an extremely busy time. learned very little about Minneapolis or St. Paul because I was never there. I was always out in the field somewhere on some kind of a problem or survey or something. Those are exciting days in the Fish and Wildlife Service because new programs are being set up. The mourning dove surveys, for example, were being set up nationally in a new randomized manner, and so I worked with that, and people were beginning to get concerned about other species in waterfowl beside the mourning dove, woodcock, for example. Some friends of Bob Burwell's, the regional director then in Minneapolis. He called me into his office one day and he says, you know, I got some friends, and he says, you know, they're real avid woodcock hunters, and he says they're concerned that we don't know much about woodcock, and he says they tell me that we ought to have some kind of a workshop or something, and pull together the few people in the United States that understand or know anything about woodcock. And he says, I wonder if you would do that. Would you represent me and work with the state of Minnesota and the University of Minnesota and help organize this woodcock gathering or something? And I said, sure, I'd be delighted to do that. And so I got to meet a lot of people then, interesting people working woodcock, and we had the first meeting at Long Lake in Minnesota, and every 2 to 3 years now there are still these woodcock workshops, and they've gotten to be big affairs, and they put out their own publication and everything, and I think maybe we had some rough notes or something. We may have Xeroxed or mimeographed back about the first one, but that was the beginning of it. Well, anyway, in Minneapolis and working with surveys and everything, I of course had contact with the people back in Patuxent, with Walt Christie and Al Geist and everything. And so one day Al Geist came out and was visiting, and he said, why don't you come back to Patuxent? We'd like to have you come back there. He said, we got a lot of exciting things going on back in Patuxent. And we have some new programs that are getting underway. We have a position we need to fill. And so we talked about it, Marilyn and I, and decided, well, yeah, perhaps, and talked to other people. And then people said, well, you know, in your career, you got to spend a couple of years back in Washington, you know, for career development, if nothing else. But, you know, spend your time back there a couple of years, and then he says you go back into the field and everything. Well, it really doesn't work that way. So I said, well, Patuxent's not Washington, D.C. Oh, that's all right. Experience is all the same. They count Patuxent the same as experience in Washington, D.C., see. But,
I'd like to stop just a moment. Okay.
Okay, we're back to Minneapolis again and the busy life there. But one of the key problems during the 3 years in Minneapolis was Canada geese, and particularly the Canada geese of the Mississippi Valley population. These are geese that breed up on the western side of Hudson Bay, and they migrate down through Wisconsin and winter in Illinois, the southern part of Illinois, Crab Orchard and Horseshoe Lake area. But this is a population that's been studied over the years, and it's a population that attracts an awful lot of hunting pressure. And wildlife populations tend to react to changes in the environment, and as did the Canada geese in the Horicon area around the refuge there, that farmers planted more and more corn, and geese learned how to capitalize on the corn to the extent of actually pulling it off the stalks. So geese lingered in Wisconsin longer periods of time and arrived in Illinois later and later. And of course, with more geese around for longer periods of time in Wisconsin, the harvest of those geese kept mounting, to the concern of Illinois. And each of the states had a theoretical goose harvest quota. Wisconsin was only to have so many geese shot, and as in Illinois, and that this would be in line with population objectives, and no overharvest would occur. Well, overharvest occurred everywhere because there's no real mechanism for determining how many geese were being actually taken by the hunters. So one of the jobs in Minneapolis was to set up some sort of a effective quota system. And after many years of state efforts to try to give some meaning to the state quotas, the decision was finally made for the federal government to administer the goose harvest system in Wisconsin. We would permit determine the number of permits and set up the mechanism and everything for the distribution of permits in cooperation with the Wisconsin Department of Fish and Game. And this was done on a computer basis, so it was really my first experience in working with computers, and which was an eye-opener. And it was one of the earliest applications, I believe, to the use of computers in regulating harvest of waterfowl. Well, it wasn't 100% successful, but it did give a better control of assurance on the quotas than we'd had before. But in the meantime, with more and more geese at Horkin, this caused more local problems, more concern on the part of Illinois and other states that harvested these geese. And everyone agreed that there were just simply too many geese at Horkin, and how to lessen the number of geese and get them moving on their way down south. And so I looked into other mechanisms in cooperation with other people as to how we could better disperse and reduce the number of geese. And in some places, harassment or driving geese, physically driving them, would lessen the attractiveness of the area, and that they'd eventually move on to other places. So the service made I say very reluctantly, a decision to harass the geese at Horkin. And so the service mounted an all-out program there, bringing in pilots, refuge pilots, flyway biologists, pilots, and gathering together propane cannons and other things that are used for harassing geese. And well, we did cause quite a stir there, I can assure you. A lot of geese got up in the air. A lot of them came back where they were. The program ran over probably 10 days, as best I can recall. Well, in the process, of course, a lot of the Wisconsin goose hunters got concerned about this. Driving geese away would lessen their opportunities to hunt geese, not that they didn't have a lot of opportunity or more than their opportunity anyway. Became a great big political hot potato, which culminated then in the state of Wisconsin driving out the Attorney General, Assistant Attorney General, and several of his aides, and other very, very important folks in Madison, we were told, came out in a caravan, served papers on the Fish and Wildlife Service people involved in the harassment program, including myself, and we were hauled down to Beaver Dam and made an appearance before a state judge down there. We were charged with harassing geese without the consent of the state of Wisconsin. Now, of course, federal laws always take precedent, rules and regulations always take precedent over state regulations and everything. So we recognized that nothing really was going to happen out of all this, that it was chiefly a publicity measure, and probably one that the state, if you really knew the details, was reluctant to participate in. But anyway, the harassment program ran on, and I was responsible for writing an evaluation and report the thing, and I do not think it was very successful. I think there were probably other mechanisms that could have been taken for it, but at least we tried something that hadn't been proven before. Probably habitat, lessening the attractiveness of the Horkin area from an agricultural standpoint would have been far more important.
All right, hold that.
Political hate.
Go on. You were writing a report about harassment and
Yeah. Okay. And but you know, you look at it from a practical standpoint. You know, you tell farmers you're planting too much corn out here. You got to cut back your corn acreage half. That's sort of a fallacy I see we wildlifers drift into all the time. We look at a wildlife problem, and we come up with a solution to it from the viewpoint of wildlife, and really there's not much consideration about all the other factors that relate to this ever becoming a practicality. I don't know how many times I've read research. You read research reports and they propose something for the benefit of whatever the particular wildlife problem is, and the thing is totally unrealistic. It's dreaming on cloud nine. But anyway, back to the point. So anyway, the big harassment program at Horkin did draw a lot of attention. Everyone recognized that there was indeed a problem there, and the states participated thereafter a lot better in enforcement of the quotas. The overall end of it, I think, was positive in terms of benefit to the resource. If you remember, we're talking about 1966, I guess it was. We were in the Vietnam War then.
64.
Huh?
64.
64? Okay. Had begun in 64.
Yeah, but that was when you were harassing the geese.
Okay. Well, what? No, I was in Horkin. We were in Minneapolis 65 through 67.
Right.
Well, whatever it was, we were in war in Vietnam. And the Milwaukee Journal always had a great cartoon, and I remember the one that shows LBJ at his desk, and he has the Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara before him. And on LBJ's desk is a globe of the world, and it's turned around so that the United States is on view, and right where Wisconsin would be, there's a little puff of smoke going up. And LBJ is looking at Bob McNamara, and he says, "Bob," he says, "how many troops can we send to Horkin?" I've got that in here somewhere. Well, to close out the Horkin matter, about 5 months after all the harassment had ceased and everything, we got papers from the state of Wisconsin, which officially withdrew the charges against us for harassing geese in Wisconsin without state permit. Okay.
And then you went on to Patuxent.
Yeah. Okay. Patuxent. So it's still in Minneapolis, and Al Geist came out, and it was a recruiting trip, I guess, because he wanted us to go back to Patuxent and work with these new programs and everything. One of the new programs is called the Accelerated Research Program, and this was to benefit further research on the migratory game birds that weren't waterfowl. Over the years, the great bulk of the service's attention and money and resources is always going into waterfowl, which is proper, I think. But on the other hand, other species, such as the mourning dove, woodcock, snipe, band-tailed pigeon, and so forth, were being overlooked. The service doing virtually little about these. So a group of concerned people, including citizens and sportsmen, got together and prevailed upon Congress to make a special appropriation of, I believe it was $1.8 million, to further research on the non-waterfowl migratory game birds. We always have a problem describing this group of birds. Some people call them migratory upland and shorebirds and different handles, but we don't have a good designation for them. So I'll just call them non-waterfowl, although it is a negative connotation. So here the service is confronted with this brand new appropriation of $1.8 million, and part of it was earmarked for research studies to be undertaken by the states, and part of it to be done by the Fish and Wildlife Service. And how do you distribute this pot of money in a useful and meaningful way? So that was the job I got into upon getting back to Patuxent. My title was really Chief of Migratory Shore and Upland Game Bird Studies, but this is a big part of the job at that first year. And so it meant a lot of meetings with people, state people and the federal people and the various associations of state fish and game commissioners and the International Association and so forth. And so we laid out criteria as to types of research that were needed, and how interested states could apply for grants under the program, and what the reporting requirements were and things of that sort. And so that was quite interesting. It involved a lot of travel around the country. And so we got the program off and running, and it is still in existence, but I don't believe it's funded very well, or certainly not satisfactory at this point. So after a while there, working with Al Geiss's and Walt Chrissie's director of the Migratory Bird Population Station, we were in Snowden Hall. This is where we were located. And Snowden Hall is, have you been to Patuxent? Snowden Hall is the old plantation building. It's a single floor building, old brick colonial type building. And do you know the story of Snowden? Snowden is now a two-story building. But if you look at the bricks on the outside of Snowden Hall, you can see that the original building was one story. And in other words, a second floor has been put on top of Snowden Hall. And the story they tell back there is that when Mrs. Snowden moved out there to occupy this plantation, she was very put out that, people of our standing don't live in single floor dwellings. You know, you have to have a second floor if you're going to be anybody very important. And so thereupon a second floor was added to Snowden Hall. And if you visit Patuxent, you can see where that change in roof line has been made. Anyway, we were extremely cramped because more and more people were being brought on board. Walt Chrissie was devising all sorts of new programs, a parts collection survey, for example, where hunters would send in duck wings or goose tails, and techniques have been found by Sam Carney and others working with him as to how to identify not only the species of bird, of course, from a wing. We're talking about ducks now, but also the sex of it, and in many cases also the age of it. So we're beginning to understand the population dynamics, have a little more background on this. And let me say that I've never met anyone, I don't think, with the insight that Chrissie had into what really makes the North American waterfowl duck resource click. He had amazing perspectives, and he's innovative in how to address those issues. He perfected the breeding ground surveys that the flyway biologists participate in now, and the winter surveys, and these new parts collection surveys. Also a hunter harvest survey that was based upon a sampling of persons who buy duck stamps, so-called duck stamps. So there's a nationwide randomized, semi-randomized manner of gathering basic data on duck populations. Well, simply stated, production of a resource has to equal that resource's mortality. That is the bottom line of any wildlife population. But involved in it, of course, are, well, how does mortality take its shape? What causes it? Is it controllable? Is there anything you can do about the thing? And this responsibility is particularly important, I think, when we're talking about a mortality that is permitted by the federal government, namely hunting. So we had a high obligation in that respect. And Chrissie had a wonderful insight into how these various pieces would fit together. In fact, I don't know it's generally known, but after Walt Chrissie analyzed the population of fall flight, and the regulations have been set every year, he put together his estimate as to what the breeding population survey the following year would show. And this was put into a sealed envelope, and a copy was given to the director. And I do not know of any accounting, the following year after the surveys have been taken, as exactly how Chrissy's estimates compared with what the survey data reflected. I've heard Walt talk about it on occasion, that we missed it by 2 million mallards or something in the breeding survey. But there's always an explanation. There's always an explanation as to why it didn't come out, you know, pretty much in line with his estimates. But from what I know of it, I think he must have been fairly close a lot of times in those estimates. I don't think that story's ever been told.
I've never.
And I've never seen his estimates, and I don't know much more about it than what I've related.
That still blows you away, you know. Yeah, and it's a little more formal now. I mean, we actually make projections now.
Yeah.
Are more public.
That's right. You know, we never projected that the fall flight is going to be 110 million birds, for example. And people always ask that question. And that was the most disturbing question to answer because we didn't have the mechanism for doing that. But we have much better insight into things nowadays, I think. Well, anyway, one of the exciting things there at Patuxent was the advent of the computer. And the computer arrived just, I think it was a matter of weeks, if not months. I don't think it was more than months ago. And it was a IBM 360 Model 20. It's a great thing. It's a great new machine we have over here. And a fellow by the name of Manny Vieira was in charge of what we called the ADP section. And the name was eventually changed to EDP, Electronic Data Processing. And some people would call it the Eventual Data Processing section. But before that, everything was done, all the data were on punch cards. Tens and tens of thousands of punch cards. Tons of punch cards, drawers, boxes, everywhere. Punch cards, everywhere you look were punch cards. And so they were fed through the counter, and then you'd have to resort them to find something else. And it was ungodly mess, you know, to really try to process any amount of data. So the advent of the computer was really something special. Then there's another great thing that happened. And we got these huge machines. They looked like suitcases. And these were electronic calculators. They weighed about 70 or 80 pounds. I know the gals in the office that often did the tabulation. They're too heavy for them to lift. So whenever they wanted to move, they'd always have to find a male around somewhere to help them. And these are great machines. These are cathode ray tubes. And you looked at this wonderful display of the figures up here, and you could punch things into the keyboard, and they'd change up here on the screen. And it was just absolutely magnificent. Well, the problem was they did 4 things. They added, they subtracted, they divided, and they multiplied. They did no other function. They did no more than today's little handheld calculator. Not that much, not nearly that much, little handheld calculator. And back in those days, a real problem, always a problem, was just the simple arithmetic error. By doing all these calculations manually, you always had to double check it. And you'd have someone else double check, you know, does this string of numbers add up and everything? I mean, that was an enormous handicap. And the frightful thing is how many errors slipped by and led to some consequential decision, you know, that really was wrong. I don't know of any first-hand cases offhand, but I'm sure there must have been some around. So, you know, just going from mechanized calculations to the computer was something enormous. Not that computers don't make mistakes, but the computer mistakes are mistakes made by humans working with the computers. It's nice to blame the computer, but if you dig a little deeper, you're going to find a human hand behind it somewhere. Well, of course, we found out shortly, you know, that the Model 20 was not capable of handling the data we had. We far exceeded that, and we called in IBM under contract and asked us to look at the system there at Patuxent and make recommendations. And so IBM sent in a crew, and they met with all the folks there, people in the banding office, and people involved in the surveys and all the rest of it. And they said, you know, you people have one of the most complicated data systems we've ever seen. He said, we just can hardly comprehend, the complexities of the statistical problems that you're confronted with in trying to develop regulations for hunting waterfowl and other game birds. They're just absolutely astounded with the complexity of the program and everything. Well, fortunately, Fish and Wildlife Service and our group out there at Patuxent wasn't the only one that had problems with the computer. And so this ended up then with the Department of Interior setting up a computer system. And they ended up with this huge machine. It was an IBM 360 Model 65, whatever that was. But it could do a great deal more than we could. So we would send down jobs, and they were on computer tapes, down to Interior. We had a courier. That was his main business, was take these tapes down to Washington, D.C. and wait around while they processed the jobs and everything and bring them back. And of course, when you're working in a big agency like that, different parts of the agency have competing interests and needs. So we're talking about priorities now. And we're talking about expensive, high costs. And so we'd usually run our jobs, the big jobs, at night. There's a differential charge, whether you had to have it back the same day or whatever. And so we try to economize by running our stuff in the evenings, send it down in the afternoon by courier and pick it up the next morning. And that was the way it was working, when I left there. And since then, I don't know how many generations of computers both the Patuxent and Department of Interior have gone through, but I'm sure it's very, very many. But anyway, it's fascinating in those days, working with that sort of stuff.
Okay. What's left? Okay. Good.
Yeah, I'd like to say a little bit about the Division of Management Enforcement, but it too evolved over the years. Particularly that the emphasis became more towards law enforcement and less towards the management activities that their people had participated in the past. This has both its good and bad aspects, of course. It probably made for a more sophisticated law enforcement. Concern was coming up about the endangered species and unlawful international trade. And so there's a real need for the Division of Management Enforcement, or branch of management enforcement, to change. And so it eventually became the Division of law enforcement, and probably Clark Bavin, the chief, was instrumental in that. But the professionalism of service enforcement officers became higher, I think. They were able to spend a much higher part of their time in true enforcement activities. These have been complicated by a number of things. Like I mentioned, the Endangered Species Act and CITES and some of the other regulations that gave the federal government more authority in terms of wildlife importation and preservation. Likewise, things changed from the management standpoint. Walt Christie's Migratory Bird Population Station, which I went to work under, existed there at Patuxent for, I'm guessing, maybe 10 or 12 years. And but we saw changes there also. And so eventually the name Migratory Bird Population Station was changed to the Office of Migratory Bird Management. It's located in Washington. Although Christie was located at Patuxent, he spent a great deal of time in Washington in meetings and things. It was quite on handy, at least in terms of the Washington people, to have the migratory bird population people out there in the countryside. They wanted them in closer. Also, some of the legislation had changed. In setting regulations, for example, we had to react to the impacts of the Endangered Species Program. There became what is called Section 7 consultation, that before we can set up, establish the waterfowl regulations each year, we have to go into consultation with our Office of Endangered Species to determine that none of the actions that we were proposing to do in terms of hunting migratory game birds had any impact on any species have been designated as threatened or endangered. Another change was NEPA, the National Environmental Procedures Act. This set out the means by which the federal government establishes regulations. It declares that the meetings will be open to the public, that they'll be advertised so that the public can attend. There are certain steps that require, even after the regulations are proposed, for people to respond and to evaluate them before the final regulations are promulgated. The whole series of things like this that came into being that greatly complicated the job of managing North American waterfowl and setting regulations. And a lot of these had legal consequences, so there's a justification for having solicitors at hand to review the various required documents, things of that sort. So after Walt Christie retired, the Office of Migratory Management, Bird Management under Dr. John Rogers was established. And so John's office was moved down to the Interior Building. And I stayed at Patuxent as his assistant for 2 or 3 years, as I recall, and eventually moved down to Washington myself. And my job then was chief for the branch of operations in the Office of Migratory Bird Management. And in that job I had, I suppose, probably two primary responsibilities. One was as a supervisor of the flyway representatives. I should say something about them, but these are our key people, one assigned to each of the 4 flyways, the Atlantic, Mississippi, Central, and Pacific. These are the key people that represent the Fish and Wildlife Service in migratory bird matters, and including the regulatory matters. And that was an extremely simple job from my aspect because we had such competent people in those jobs. We had Ed Addy and Warren Blandon, and Jerry Surrey is now in the Atlantic Flyway position, and we had Art Hawkins, and then Ken Gamble came along as the representative for the Mississippi Flyway. And then we had, in the Central Flyway, we had Ray Buller, and later Harvey Miller. And in the Pacific Flyway, John Shatton, who was followed by Jim Bartnick. These are all solid, competent people. And the amount of supervision and problems that part of the job entailed was pretty minimal. It was, we had a wonderful working relationship there, I guess. And the second part of the job as chief of the Office of the Branch of Operations was the regulatory procedure. And as enjoyable as the other part of the job was, this was just as much the opposite. A series of regulations and meetings and procedures and everything on a very, very tight budget, everything under stress. Once the biological data had been assembled and evaluated and made available to everyone, then we had to begin a series of meetings in-house and also meetings with the various flyway technical committees and flyway councils and public meetings required under NEPA, and doing all the consultation under the Endangered Species Act, and meetings with the Office of Management and Budget, for example. I remember one year when